ultimately, these reform movements will culminate in the most important reform movement, what will become the biggest, which is abolition. Abolition means ending slavery. Early anti-slavery folks, there had always been people who had opposed slavery. Hamilton had opposed slavery. But they tended to be more morally disapproving than demanding that it be ended. And they focused their efforts on doing things like buying slaves and returning them to Africa or the Caribbean. In 1817, the American Colonization Society in Virginia began buying slaves and shipping them back to Africa. Eventually, the United States government, the states of Virginia and Maryland, will assist this group in buying a piece of Africa, creating a new country. This is called Liberia. It's down there on the map there. And sending slaves back there. And this was their idea of helping African Americans. Now, most slaves didn't want to go. They had never been to Africa. They were almost certainly born in America or maybe the Caribbean. But it had little impact on slavery in the long run. This didn't take any major steps towards ending slavery here in America. I should point out the capital of Liberia is called Monrovia because James Monroe was the president at the time, so it was named after him. The most outspoken of the abolitionists is this white guy here with the glasses, William Lloyd Garrison. He's from Boston, and he begins in 1831 an intense campaign against slavery. He rejects the gradual end of slavery, and he demands abolition immediately. He particularly attacks whites who try to justify slavery or talk about how slavery hurts white people as well. He's really disgusted by these sorts of arguments. He's rare because not only does he want slavery to end, he wants equal rights for African Americans. And he's really about the only white person calling for that. There's very few people who would have supported that, not white people anyway. And he would use very inflammatory rhetoric. He was very much in the face of the white Southern slave owner. And in 1832, he founds the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Now, while it is true that a northern black was probably materially worse off than a slave, meaning they were poor, they had worse clothes, they ate worse, they were free. And so even with this reality, they still fought, the northern blacks still argued passionately for freedom. Sometimes maybe more passionately that was in their best interest. In 1829, a freed black man named David Walker would write, "America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears. Kill your masters or be killed." So here is somebody advocating the murder of whites. But most anti-slave or abolitionists were not violent like this. Sojourner Truth would become famous throughout the country in the 1830s as a former slave who would travel around the country speaking about her life as a slave. By the 1850s, the top abolitionist in the country is Frederick Douglass. This is an escaped slave from Maryland who goes to England because he's an escaped slave, and if he gets caught, he'll be arrested. And he spends a couple of years speaking in England about what it's like to be a slave in America. He returns in 1847, takes the money he made from speaking in England, buys his freedom from his former master, and begins publishing a newspaper in the North called the North Star. In 1845, he writes the brilliant and powerful book, A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And if you ever have a chance, you should read it. It's short, easy to read, and very powerful. And he becomes maybe the greatest argument for abolition because he is obviously brilliant and really explains what it's like to be a slave. Although many Southerners accused him of being sort of a parrot, basically accusing him of having memorized a speech that white people gave him. This wasn't true, but what else were they going to say in the face of this brilliant black man? Now, it's important to understand that even in the North, few people supported abolition. They feared that it would lead to war, they feared that there would be backlash from the freed slaves, and they feared that if the slaves were freed from the South, they would all head north. And the North was pretty racist as well, and they didn't really want a bunch of slaves moving up there either. And so abolitionists in the North were frequently attacked by Northerners. In 1834, an abolitionist headquarters was burnt down by a mob in Philadelphia, which leads to a race riot. In 1835, William Lloyd Garrison barely avoids being lynched in Boston, which was probably the most abolitionist place in the country. And one newspaper editor of an abolitionist named Eliza Lovejoy actually was lynched and killed in Illinois for his abolitionist views. Garrison will become more and more radical, and eventually will turn against the government itself. He'll call the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it condoned slavery, which it did. He also insists that women be full members in the abolitionist movement. He believed, to some extent anyway, between equality between men and women. And he'll eventually become an extreme pacifist, opposing all wars. In 1843, he calls for the North to secede from the South, but he was the most extreme abolitionist, probably. Most remained moderate. Most would try to appeal to slaveholders' conscience, try to make them feel bad. And then when they sought legislation, it would be things like protecting runaway slaves, not ending slavery. In 1839, a group of slaves on a ship called the Amistad will mutiny, seize control of the ship, and be declared by the U.S. Navy pirates. Because international slave trade was illegal now, they actually have a legal case, and they are going to sue for their freedom, claiming that their being on the ship at all was a violation of the ban on the international slave trade. Abolitionists will raise money for their legal defense and hire former President John Quincy Adams to argue for their freedom in front of the Supreme Court. And Adams is going to get them freed. Abolitionists will then raise money and send these slaves back to Africa. These guys actually were from Africa, so that made sense. In another case, in Prigg v. Pennsylvania in 1842, the Supreme Court rules that states don't have to aid in returning slaves, so that if my slave runs away to another state, that state isn't responsible for returning it. Abolitionists want to end the domestic slave trade and end slavery in D.C., and that's their big push at this time. In 1840, we actually have a candidate run for president on the Liberty Party demanding free soil. Now, free soil, you must understand, does not mean an end to slavery. It means an end to the expansion of slavery. It means no slavery in the West. Very few people, though, were concerned with the civil rights of African Americans. Most people opposed slavery either because they saw it as hurting them economically, or they didn't want black people coming where they were. So maybe they planned on moving west, or they did live out west and they didn't want African Americans there. So a lot of people who opposed slavery actually did it because they themselves were racist, which I think is something we don't understand. Some abolitionist groups in New England raised money and gave weapons to John Brown, the man who will try to lead an insurrection and will begin insurrections in Kansas and Virginia, leading to the deaths of numerous people. Anti-slave propaganda was very powerful as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe will write a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which will sell over 300,000 copies and be turned into a very popular play. It demonized the South and slavery in general. Now, slavery was terrible. I don't want to make it sound like I'm defending slavery, but Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't know anything about slavery. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin doesn't really provide us with much insight into how slavery worked. It really provides us an insight about how the North stereotyped slavery. And, of course, the South was very angry because they considered the book to be terribly inaccurate, which it was, but that doesn't mean slavery was any better. And actually, her book would be one of the things that's going to help propel us to a civil war.